everyone. The recording is in progress. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. Just a short introduction. My name is Zoe Sinclair. I'm the founder of an organisation called This Can Happen. We are based in London, but have a global community and organise global events. Our aim is to empower workplace mental well-being, and by that I'm looking at right across the spectrum of workplace mental well-being, from those people that are in the workplace who have a diagnosis of some sort, all the way through to common everyday problems, everyday situations that have an impact on our mental well-being, and grief absolutely being one of those. We have started a big conversation about grief at This Can Happen, and we are sort of taking it around the world and doing some research on it. And we realise, as I'm sure all of you do while you're here today, it is such a huge topic that is not spoken about enough. And that is why we are here today, looking at understanding potentially or what misunderstandings are, how we can help each other, how workplaces can be better informed, and we're going to have a great discussion today. I really wanted each one of our panelists to give you a 30-second introduction to themselves, so you know what a great panel we've got today. So firstly, Margot, over to you.
Great, thank you. I'm Margot Folks. As the president of On Target Consulting, I help organizations and individuals act strategically, improve their performance, and achieve their business goals. In addition, I also work with leaders at all levels to create more compassionate workplaces by acknowledging and speaking openly about grief and loss.
Great, thank you so much, Margot. Tim, over to you.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here today. So my name's Tim Moy. I'm the manager of the Delta Care and Scholarship Funds at Delta Airlines, which is our nonprofit that helps Delta people who are in a financial situation that they couldn't have expected. I'm also the founder of Wrenched Hearts, which is our peer support group for parents who have lost children. We have roughly 380 members across the world in Wrenched Hearts, and it all came from my own grief, so I had to find a place to put it. So that's why I'm here today.
Thank you so much, Tim, and obviously we're going to be hearing more about exactly what you have done a little bit later. And Megan, welcome to you. Please do introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you. I'm Megan Reardon Jarvis, and I am a psychotherapist. I'm a trauma therapist. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I specialize in grief and loss. Like Margot, I have a small, mine is small, a small consulting firm. We go into companies who are struggling actually now with sort of the great resignation and the quiet quitting motivation inside the workplace, and try to help them identify where loss is present and speak about that loss so they can do what they want to do, which is go back to work. Grievers know you don't go back. And I host a podcast called Grief is My Side Hustle, and anyone can find me there. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. And Megan, you also have had personal experience of loss as well, which we will go through and also talk about in a second. So as you can see, we've got three great panelists here, and I'm just going to be facilitating the conversation, but I want you to participate as well. So I've opened up the sort of anonymous, the Q&A box, and I've also got the chat box. I will be monitoring that. Please feel free to send in any questions, any comments at any time during the session, and I would love to involve you. What I'm going to say as well is a very big thank you to you for many of you filled in the pre-questions in the registration. And I tell you why I say that, and I told our panelists this when we first decided to do some work around grief. My team and I got together and said, I said, I really want to understand more about people's experience of grief, and especially their experience in the workplace. And I'd really like to ask some questions in the registration of a webinar. And I had one half of my team, Zoe, saying, oh, Zoe, you know what? When you sign up for a webinar and suddenly you're asked loads of questions, it's so annoying. You just want to sign up for the webinar. Please, let's not go down the route of asking questions because nobody's going to answer them. And then the other half of my team was saying, Zoe, I think it's such a good idea. We'll really get to understand a lot more about grief. So I was in a bit of a dilemma. I didn't know what to do because I totally understand about it driving me crazy when people ask me my date of birth and my this, that, and the other when I'm signing up for a webinar, and it puts me off entirely. But we decided to make it not compulsory. So there were the questions. You didn't need to answer them if you didn't want to. And that's what we got. And I think there is something about grief and loss that people do want to talk about it. People do want to share in the right environment. And I can only thank you because most of you did fill in all those questions. And so we have got a really rich understanding of where you are coming from. So very, very quickly, I want you to understand, and I'm looking down so you know at my notes. Just to give you two examples of questions that we asked you in the registration. One was, how did you feel your employer and colleagues managed your loss? And we have had everything written here, from amazing support and empathy to poorly, horribly. They were quite understanding. Company was very flexible with my time. The support was available, but I had to go and find it. There was no proactivity from HR. I started an informal bereavement group. My managers and HR supported me. However, it's harder for colleagues to understand, all the way through to actually someone who registered today saying it was a very difficult experience, and the way that employers and colleagues handled it played a huge role in me leaving that workplace. So that gives you a bit of context. And the final question that I wanted to mention to you was, we asked, how has grief affected you? And these were some of the responses. It does not get better with time. I have a greater appreciation for every moment and increased empathy towards others. It's affected me a great deal. It's affected my concentration and focus. It arrives, it stays for a while, I acknowledge it and I face it. I spend time with it until it's ready to move on. And finally, two last comments. It has changed the person I am. And finally, the experience affected my memory, clarity of thought, focus, appetite, and work. So I just wanted to give you those that context of where we are, which I'm sure many of you can empathize with. And I'm going to go straight to Megan to start with, to say, Megan, you have, I watched one of your TEDx's, which was about the danger of neglecting grief in the workplace. And I thought it was fascinating, and it summed up for me so many things linked to workplaces are not investing. And when I say investing, I don't mean necessarily in financial terms, but it's just not something that is being talked about, and it affects every single employee in some way, shape or form. So Megan, just starting off this conversation, give us a little bit of an understanding about your experiences, your personal experiences, and the danger of neglecting grief in the workplace.
Well, thank you for that question. And I'm really holding the last comment that you read about brain fog and about memory. And so I'm going to speak to both of those things. So I've been in the field of grief and loss for 20 years. I had a childhood experience that really informed how I felt about the world. That was a teenager who died. So grief has been part of my sort of stitched into my DNA very early. My dad died in 2017 from small cell cancer. It was a terminal diagnosis when he got it. And my family, I have 5 brothers and sisters, we participated in his death because we understood it was coming. And it was very sad and it was very hard, but we were able to prepare ourselves to some degree. We had time to seek out support from counselors and priests, read books if we wanted to, and we could alert our workplaces that we were going to need some time off. In 2019, I was on vacation with my mom and she died suddenly in her sleep, completely unexpectedly. And part of the reason I talk so much about grief and loss is that we have, those of us in the grief world talk about the small percentage of people who have traumatic experiences with loss. That grief isn't a mental health problem. It's just a developmental stage that we all go through, and that we're sort of wired to know how to grieve. Like our body knows how to resolve some of these symptoms. But in my experience, I was really stunned to be on the inside of memory loss. I was really stunned. I had some experience with brain fog in pregnancy, because brain fog, we know, is sort of driven by some hormonal changes. But what I do with folks is say, hey, listen, when there is a death, whether it's sudden or not, your body responds to that as though it is life-threatening, with the fight, flight, freeze, and then if those don't work, the sort of collapse responses. That's designed to take care of you in the moment. So when we're talking about fresh grief, we're talking about a person inside a body that has just responded as though it was in a life-threatening situation of their own. And so when a lot of the talking that I do starts with, hey, did you know there's a small part at the back of the brain that enlarges when we're under threat? And people know what that feels like. Oh my gosh, I'm startled. And when that happens, a whole lot of short circuiting of the rest of our brain happens, because our body thinks that it is needing to run away from a bear or something super dangerous. And it rushes blood to our organs to keep us alive. So people will feel their arms run cold. When we're not educated in this, we think we're going crazy. And without the education, you don't realize that that triggering happens over and over and over. So it's not just when you get the phone call that your mother died. Oh, I'm in a startle response. Here comes the brain fog. Here comes the memory loss. I wake up for days until my brain can integrate this information, forgetting that my mother died, going through the startle response again, or being triggered by the smell of her perfume. Why this is so important is that when people don't know what's going on with them, when we live in a culture that doesn't make room for this, people are going to work. And I'll give you an example. I worked with a nurse. Her husband died of a heart attack in his sleep. They've been married for 35 years. Her primary job, she had 5 days off, which is in this country, if you can believe it, pretty generous. And her job was to manage up to 30 patients on a floor, knowing when they needed their medication changed and how to titrate that medication, like complicated math. But she had what is a very common symptom, memory loss. And multi-stepped instructions are also really difficult. I mean, we just know this. Grievers have told us, and we know the neuroscience. So she goes back to work, not realizing that this symptom is common. So she doesn't want to tell anybody because she feels crazy. And she makes mistakes at her job. And so suddenly this thing that she loves so much, she is up in front of a board review because she gave somebody the wrong medication. And by the time I came into that conversation, she was deep in shame on top of grieving. And she was likely going to lose her job. And the hospital that she worked at did not want her to lose her job either. That's what I mean when I'm talking about how important it is for us to talk about, you know, and I've said this so many times, sort of like the same class that our kids get before they hit puberty, so that they don't think it's crazy when their voice begins to crack or there's hair in weird places. We actually can teach that same information about how we grieve with our bodies, how bodies go through grief. It's not the same for everyone, but it is really similar across cultures because everybody has a human body. So that, I know that now because I've embodied it. I heard the story so many times, but I just couldn't, I couldn't remember the name of the street that I grew up on. And when I say that, I don't mean for a couple minutes. I mean for like 4 or 5 days. I would go back and be like, what the heck is the name of our street?
So are you saying as well then, just going back to the workplace, that there needs to be education in the workplace as well?
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. So there's 2 pieces. There's just like you have training, on sexual harassment, that most workplaces are doing some DEI work right now because they want people to be aware of what it's like to have racism in this way present in your workplace. We're human beings bringing our whole human selves to work. So the proactive education is actually an incredible way for your workplace to just tell you what kind of culture they want to be. That you may not be grieving now, but you may grieve one day. And remembering that your workplace brought in an expert to talk about grief symptoms and how we can make a cultural shift around grief lets you know it's okay to come to work and talk to your manager about what's going on. Then there is the aspect of how do we create some flexibility at work? But I don't think you can do that if you don't educate people first. Why would a manager agree to give somebody, mornings off for the next 3 months and let people work later if they didn't understand that sleep is a profound issue for people, and that actually it doubles down on your activation if you don't sleep, and that it's really common for grievers to have a very hard time falling asleep? Why would they want to be flexible? What's wrong with you? Why can't you get into work? I understand that your husband died, but work is from 9 to 5. But if you've had the education that one of the primary things that gets disrupted is people's sleep cycles, not only is there some empathy, but there's some core understanding of it doesn't matter how you feel about it. It doesn't matter if that's annoying to you that your employee needs to come in later. They need to come in later, or they're going to come in, but they're not going to really be effective.
Okay. So that's so fascinating. And thank you for that really, really great introduction. Obviously, we've got so much more to talk about, and I will come back to you shortly. But Tim, I wanted to come to you to give us an understanding of your personal experience and what happened then at work.
Absolutely. So back in 2011, February 5th, a day I'll never forget, I got the phone call that my 25-year-old son was found deceased. And at the time I was planning his wedding, right? So I had to shift from planning a wedding to planning a funeral. And I'm by nature, I'm a former mechanic, former aircraft engineer. I fix things, and I found something that I couldn't fix. So just like Megan was talking about, there was this fog. I didn't know what to do because I couldn't fight or flight. I couldn't collapse. I had to do something. So I began planning. That was my way of fixing it. About 2 years later, I met another mechanic on the hangar floor who lost his 18-year-old son about 4 months after I lost Jason. And we started talking about our grief, our kids. We showed the tattoos that we got for our kids. We cried, we hugged, and 2 mechanics that looked like bikers in or extras in a biker movie, hugging on the hangar floor, not normal. But it made a change in me. I said, this is right. This is what we should be doing. We should be talking about it. So I started this informal little peer support group at Delta Airlines in 2013, and we had 10 people show up, and we began telling our stories, right, to each other. We got each other. We understood each other's grief, and no one else could say that. That thing blossomed and bloomed, and today there's over 300 members, and we have chapters in different cities, and it's something that the company supported and gave us the time that we needed. My team, when I was going through my grief, they were amazing. They took on my role. They made sure I had all the time I needed. That's not common. That's not something every day in every business. I will tell you, as far as I know, and as far as the research I've done, Delta Airlines is the only company in the US that has peer support groups for grievers. I can't find another one. That's been key to my healing. And also what I've heard, and I'm going to try not to offend Megan, is most people who are referred to therapy through their EAP program, when they go to that therapist hasn't lost a child. They know what they've learned in school. They don't know what that griever's going through. So having someone in the workplace that understands where you are and where you have to go is really, really powerful.
Thank you, Tim. So you've touched on, well, so many different things. So first of all, just quickly, I think it's really interesting how you mentioned the EAP. And I would be keen to understand from our audience if anybody has made use of an EAP in terms of grief themselves, and if they've had the same the experience, whether it's positive, negative, whether they were pointed to the EAP for grief. I think that would be just interesting information for us to hear from the audience, as well as understanding whether there are any other peer support groups here on this call. Presuming that we aren't inundated with that statistic of lots of peer support groups, as you suggested, just take me back to that. For somebody sitting on this call, whatever their loss might be, did you literally just do it yourself, or did you go to someone to say, this is what I want to do? How did those other 10 people find you? Like, was it online? Was it in person? Just like literally logistical information. How does someone start this?
Oh, that's a great question. And yes, I literally went to, at the time I was working as a fleet engineer. I went to my leader in technical operations and said, I want to do something like this. And they said, okay, what do you need from us? I said, well, first of all, I need permission, right? I need a space. And they were very willing, and they gave us the time that we needed. Typically, we met over lunch. And what we did was we just posted it on our internal DeltaNet that we're going to have a meeting on such and such a date. If you've lost a child, please feel free to come. And like I said, 10 people showed up. Within a year, we had 35 that were showing up. After we got to a certain size within Tech Ops, we decided, let's see if we can go corporate wide, because Delta Airlines is a global airline. We're all over the world. So I went to the executive vice president of HR, just pitched my idea. They were very welcoming to that. And we had a meeting in 2014 where 50 people flew in from all over to Atlanta. And we just started having the conversation about how do we meet each other's needs, since we're all in different places, and the company supported it.
Wow. Okay. That's super interesting. So sorry, someone very helpfully, I'm wondering why nobody's commenting on the chat. Apparently the chat is disabled. I'm going to see if I know how to disable it or enable it. But if I can't do that, please everybody just use the Q&A box and I will read out the questions or any comments. But thank you for alerting me that it's disabled. I have no idea why. Right, so you literally, and it sort of just went from there. And what I believe, Tim, now is that there are other groups, not just linked with parental loss, that have also now happened. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so you're right. So what we did was we took that model that we had developed with Wrenched Hearts, and today we have a group called Stop the Stigma for people who have lost someone to suicide. We have a group called Hope Thrives. It's a cancer support group. We have a group that's for miscarriage. And we have a group called We Care for caregivers who are bringing their whole self to work while bringing their whole caregiver to work, right? They're taking care of someone at home full time. The model just works because when you put people in a group that has a shared experience and you get to carry that load together, it lightens your load. It's been amazing to see these little peer support groups. Some of them are only virtual. They just live in our version of Facebook on internal Delta Airlines, and they can chat back and forth and support each other's needs. It's been really powerful seeing what a small peer support group can do for those employees who are trying to come back to work. They're trying to understand their grief and they can't. They need someone else that says, I get you.
Yeah, and right, people are writing into the question box now, so thank you. So first of all, someone rightly has said, kudos to Delta. This needs to be replicated. But just before I go to Margot, Tim, another question, and I think is really important. What about when work don't recognise that is needed? I mean, obviously Delta are amazing, and I can't imagine why a company would want to say no, but some companies may say no because they've never done anything like this before, they're scared, I'm sure there are plenty of reasons why a company would say no. So I imagine that some people go with a lot of trepidation to their seniors to ask for that. What if a company says no?
I think the company needs to be prepared for an exodus of some sort. They should be prepared for a loss in productivity. They should be prepared for a financial impact to their bottom line. This costs the company literally nothing other than a little bit of time and some understanding, yet the repayment is huge because you are allowing this employee to bring themselves in 100%, right, with their grief, with their loss, with their fears. And I know that Margot will have a lot to say about that.
So, Tim, thank you. There are just so many things that we want to talk to each one of you about, but I'm, going to turn to Margot now. Margot, please give us a little bit of background on your experience, your personal experience, and what you have gone on to do.
All right. So my introduction to the grief world, if you will, came when our 13-year-old son, Jimmy, was diagnosed with brain cancer in 2006. And up until that point, I had been very fortunate in that the folks that I had lost were all elderly relatives. And so we went through 8 years of treatment with him before he passed away in 2014 at the age of 21. And coming home from his celebration of life up in Portland, my mother got ill and declined over the next year and then died about a year after Jimmy did. So in a very short period of time, I had two horrific losses. And I sort of cast about for a website that was comforting to me and couldn't really find something. So I decided to start my own. It's called Saltwater, and it's an online community and resource for someone who's grieving any sort of loss. And at the same time I launched Saltwater, I also relaunched my consulting practice with a lot of trepidation because of exactly what Megan talked about. You know, I was still foggy, I had memory issues. I didn't know if I could get up in front of a client and facilitate a meeting or give a speech. But I decided it would be good for me to do that. And when I first started, I really saw these two things as very separate. Saltwater is a labor of love. There's no charge. There's no pop-up windows. It's purely support and connection for people who are grieving. And in my mind, my consulting practice was all about business. And what I quickly realized was that not only were so many people that I worked with relating to the grief work that I did and asking me to bring it into my work, I also realized that I'd been doing work around grief and loss for years and hadn't used the terms. So for example, I would get called into a corporation who had done a massive layoff, and I would work with the team that was left and help them rebuild the culture and improve morale. But I didn't talk about that so much as being a loss or the grief that came with that. I acknowledged it and how hard it was. But it really, integrating these two things had me really understand the connection. And then the other thing that happened is I started hearing from people who were joining Saltwater and reaching out to me. I started hearing their stories about going back to work. And the most common thing that I heard was, I lost one of my most important people. My company might have been great in the very early moments. They sent flowers, they came to the memorial service, they made meals, and then I went back to work and no one said a word. And you know, as Megan and Tim well know, and you too, Zoe, there is a lot of focus on bereavement leave, and it's very important. We do not give enough in this country, but we don't spend time looking at that reentry. And so when grievers go back to work, it's so challenging for them because people don't know what to say and they so often default to saying nothing. So these kinds of conversations and this opportunity to raise awareness, to be the one at work who reaches out to someone else who's grieving, I think that's how we make change.
So many things to talk about as well. Megan, go on, you go first.
I've just thought so many things when Margot was talking, and you know, Tim's example and Margot's example, and to some degree my own, of people who were trying to put in place what they needed for themselves and then offer that as a resource to other people. What companies need to understand is not everybody can do that. And so again, like one of the questions I get really often is, well, what's the boundary? If we start talking about feelings, we're going to have, you know, they start to imagine that a widget company is going to become a mental health center. And, you know, I've done some work where the griever's life has changed so significantly that actually working at this company is not a good choice for them anymore. And it's almost like that joke when Gwyneth Paltrow broke up with her husband and they called it conscious uncoupling. There's no reason why we can't say to our HR department, this isn't working out, and the HR department be able to say, how can we help you even now? How can we support you? If your memory loss is such that this job isn't working out, is there another job inside the company? Or can we help you get another job outside of the company? It reminds me a lot of parenting, which is like, it can be super inconvenient that your 13-year-old is in a bad mood during the family reunion, but grief shows up as it shows up. And if you do not address it, that 13-year-old is going to have a really hard time and the family reunion might get ruined. So for work purposes, when CEOs say, I don't know if this is something that we can do here, what I say it is something you're doing here. It's not can you, it's already happening. And Tim's point, which is you lose staff, I know you lose staff because they come to me and they say, you know, I used to really like my boss, I don't like him anymore. And when I ask why, they start using words like being disrespected. And, you know, Margot, your point about being able to figure out the right words and talk about the words is so key. Tim's group is often, that kind of a group is often how people learn. Tim is a little further down the line. And so he says, you know, I was really angry, or I was really disappointed, or I felt afraid. And somebody else says, oh my God, that's what that feeling is. They're learning from each other. And so, you know, folks that say, no, you can't have a meeting here. You know, we're not trying to unionize. What we are trying to do is support each other. And I love hearing about Delta Airlines being supportive of this. And there are organizations out there that could be leading this. What's the worst thing that's going to happen? I mean, one of the things my consulting firm, Talking Point Partners, does is we'll buy all the books you need and we'll set up a library for you. And we'll even tell you where that library should be so that your employees that are coming into the office are walking past a wall of books that say, we care about your feelings. That's better than an inspirational poster.
Yeah.
But, you know, we're not able, at least in this country, we do not do a magnificent job of those little electrical currents that are our emotions, that are roiling, that are just all coming on, cascading on us when we're grieving.
Yeah.
It's hard to pin them down and say, ooh, that one is sadness and that one is anger and that. But if I'm not given a chance to slow down and identify those, then when I come to you as my manager and you say very caringly, how are you doing? I don't have any words to tell you how I'm doing. I can't say, you know, I'm really struggling in the morning because I'm feeling frustrated, or I need some room to do that. And any workplace that thinks that they are helping anyone, including themselves or their bottom line, by saying we don't have room for that here. That's not what we do here. It is there. It's in your workplace.
Yeah.
You're just not allowing people to talk about it. And anyone who has done any work with feelings knows nothing good comes from not talking about your feelings.
I want to just go back to something that's been picked up in questions here. Margot rightly mentioned that the re-entry point is huge. Now, Tim, you said that your colleagues were great. And I'd love to know what great looked like for you, and Margot, to hear any points from you as well on this, because one of the questions we're being asked is, what can employers and co-workers do or put in place to help employees with re-entry? So Tim, to you first, any points on that?
Absolutely. So re-entry is probably your first re-injury point when you come back to work. You're coming back raw. You're still carrying your grief, right? One of the things that I found very encouraging was once I had started this peer support group, I would have managers reach out to me and say, hey, I've got an employee that's coming back. Can you come talk to my team about how we handle the person before they come back? That is huge, to have someone to care enough to say, what do we say? What do we not say? How do we bring them back into the office, without re-injuring them? My team, when I was going through my loss, the first thing my boss said was, take the time you need. We've got your work. So they alleviated that pressure from me to be able to go grieve, to do the things that you need to do, plan a funeral, go buy clothes for, your recently deceased, all those things that are just so raw. And I think that re-entry point, that's key. If you don't do it right then you just re-injure them. Now they're going to shut down. You're going to prolong their grief.
Yeah, really interesting. Margot, any thoughts on this really brilliant point that you made about re-entry not being great for a lot of people?
So a couple of key things that workplaces can do, because as Tim mentioned, Delta, I've found that Delta is the only company I'm aware of who has this kind of support. But one of the key things is that manager of the person who's grieving needs to let everyone know that this has happened. When I was writing my book, I was shocked by the number of people who told me they had gone back to work and been off for, say, a week with the bereavement, and had someone ask them how their vacation was. Or in one case, one woman went back to work after her mother died, and someone asked her how her mom was doing. So we need to communicate this to other people so that people know. That's one thing. Another thing that can really help is asking that grieving person before they come back to choose what I would call a point person. And that can be someone in the same department or team. It can be somebody just somewhere else in the company. It can be somebody in HR. But that person can run interference for that griever. So for example, if Susie keeps showing up in your office and saying, oh, I want to take you to coffee, and I know you just lost your son and I really want to help, and you don't really like Susie that much, you can ask your point person to just have a conversation with her and very gently say, Margot's having a hard time right now, and she so appreciates your interest, but she needs a little bit of space. Whereas if you leave it to the person who's grieving, as we all know, we don't have the emotional bandwidth, and we're much more likely to say something sharp. And then we have a whole new challenge and a new set of pain point here at work now, because we've created an issue unintentionally with a coworker who means well, but is someone that we don't want support from. And then finally, I think it's really important that managers check in very regularly when someone who's grieving goes back to work, because we change by the hour oftentimes with what we need and with what things are hard and what things are not. And so it's just important to set that tone right up front, that I'm going to check in with you. How are you today? What kind of help do you need? So that people feel free, when they even proactively, as they get a little bit further in their journey, to say, I really need help with this, or I need some, Megan mentioned this idea of going in a bit later to work. I need some flexibility, that kind of thing. That dialogue with your direct manager is so important to start right from the beginning.
Zoe, can I say something?
Yes, of course. You go on.
Margot, so everything that you just said is completely perfect. And I just want to stress this one piece that you said, because I hear about it a lot. The well-meaning, overbearing coworker. Everyone wants to do and say the right thing. And death and loss can be really triggering. And we have this fantasy that people who have been through grief are the ones who do the best at showing up for a colleague's grief. And some of the time that I have been called into workplaces, it's because someone who has grieved before has brought forward what they would have needed, which is not working for the people who are grieving now. So that idea of having a co-created plan, my team actually, when are you coming back? You're coming back on Friday, which means by Wednesday, we're going to send you a note that says, Sharon has identified she'd like to be your point person. Is that okay with you? Because maybe we think but maybe not. You let us know we have done our side. We think Sharon would work. Sharon would like to do the work. If you don't want Sharon, let us know. We have taken, Tim said something so important. There are so many companies out there that are like, we sent casseroles, gift cards, all those, but we didn't cover their work while they were away. So they have 10,000 emails so here's how we covered your work. Alan, Peter, and Josephine have taken over your accounts. They will check in with you about when it would be a good time for you to hear about the work that they've been doing. And then this last piece, which again, Margot said it, managers have to be empowered to be flexible. That's where I hear some resistance, like, well, if we do it for her, we do it for him, then we have to do it for we're not, every person is a separate case. We are not making federal policy. If they are telling you they want to work late or they need to be home on Wednesdays because there's no childcare, then they work that out with their manager. So the last piece we say is we'd like to co-create some flexibility with you. We're ready to have that conversation about what your workload looks like and what your timing in the office looks like. Come and let us know. This will be an ongoing conversation, because I know a lot of people that are really excited to get back to work and not have the sad faces and not have people coming to them and saying, I heard about your mom. So that you have to get like consent and permission, and then tell the whole team, Margot's coming back to work. We've already reached out to her. She's asked that people do not give her the sad face, and, to just treat her like things are happening. Right. Tim just did a great example. So I just wanted to say that. I wanted to say that is it's such an important format. And it's okay that managers and teams don't think about this. They didn't take a class in business school on how to address it. But all three of us have talked to hundreds and hundreds of grievers, and they all say some version of this same thing.
And I think that's so important. And Megan, thank you for that. And there's another question that I want to address back to Margot and Megan. Tim has just sent the person a written response, but I think it's a good one to speak to everyone together. Margot, someone says, we are constantly told that illness and bereavement is a confidentiality issue. And this is, Megan, sort of what you were talking about. But when Margot said we should tell others, how can we do that without them feeling their confidentiality has been breached? While I lost my son, I didn't necessarily want the entire company to know. Okay. So I think that's really interesting as well. And I suppose Megan talks about, you do the one-on-one with them, and if they say no, you tell people if not. But is there anything else we should be thinking about with this confidentiality issue?
So I think that's sorry, Megan.
Sorry, to Margot first.
Go ahead, Margot.
So I think that's really the key thing, Zoe, is that one-on-one conversation with the person who's grieving. Because the other way this comes up is if the loss has been, for example, through suicide or overdose, people may very well not want that disclosed. But even to say, Tim has suffered a loss, and that is all I can share with you, is that that's happened. that is enough to let people know that something significant has happened, and that and any of us can figure out, even if we haven't had a devastating loss, we can figure out that Tim is going to be different when he comes back to work. We may not know like what exactly to expect, but we know that something has happened. And so that's enough, because the person who asked the question is absolutely right. There's a lot of things that we, as a company, you can't disclose. And then there's also a number of things that the person who's grieving may not want disclosed. But disclosing something is what's so important, so that people know that there is going to be a change. And also because as you go to the team, for example, to Tim's point, and ask them to lean in and cover some of the work, if you don't explain that this is because Tim has suffered a loss, then that's where you get resentment and people saying, well, why am I covering for Tim? Where is Tim? What's going on here?
Yeah. And so Tim, your experience on that was what exactly?
Well, when I got that phone call, so as a longtime employee, my first thought was, oh, I've got to make sure work understands why I'm not going to be there, right? So I called my boss and I told him exactly what was going on. And I told him, I'm not going to be available, and I'll let you know when I will be available, even if that means my job. I'm okay with that. And my boss said, you take the time you need, we'll cover you. But I gave my boss permission right away to tell my team where I was and why I was, which gave him the opportunity to say, hey, Tim's out, he lost his son, and we're gonna take care of him. Some of it falls to the griever to give that permission, but mostly it's the boss asking the right questions. Can I tell the team what's going on?
Mm-hmm. And Tim, just staying with you for a second, somebody's asked a really interesting question, and I wonder whether it's come up in your grief support groups. And I'd like to open it to everyone else as well. But the question has been written: do the panelists consider it unhealthy to use work as somewhat of a distraction from grief? Should the sufferer choose to do so willingly? Do you think it's possible for someone to totally compartmentalize after trauma or loss? Tim, what do you think about that? I think it's a very interesting question.
It is, and there's two pieces to that. One, absolutely, it's normal, it's okay to use work as your distraction, and it's not unhealthy, it's not unnatural. People do it all the time. I do not think that you can totally compartmentalize it when you go to work. Especially if it's a very close loss, a parent, a sibling, a child, something like that. You're going to carry some of that in with you every day, and you can try to compartmentalize it. I do think when you compartmentalize it too much, you're setting yourself up for something down the road that's going to be an episode. It's going to come out. It will find a way.
Yeah.
Okay, Tim, thank you. And Megan, you're nodding your head. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, anything that we can do to give ourselves a little pendulum swing from periods of time where we're grieving and periods of time where we're just in the present or living is actually, that's well established, good, healthy grieving. So if, people can distract themselves with work, they can distract themselves with Netflix, they can distract themselves with cooking. All of that is sort of like grieve as a verb, but we're not always in the moments that we're grieving. So I love the idea. And I really understand that people want to be a version of themselves that they remember. I really love that I, function very well at work. When my mother died, my son joined a brand new soccer team, and none of those people knew that my mother died. And I loved going to that soccer team because I could just be the old Megan who, hadn't had those experiences. But to Tim's point, we don't really compartmentalize emotions. So, Margot just gave a really beautiful description of like the best grief educated response, which is when someone says, I don't want you to tell anything at work. That's not really possible because people will feel it from you. They will see your behaviors. Someone who is a friend will know, and you guys will be talking and you'll be crying at lunch. And so there's no such thing as a vacuum. So when something terrible happens to an employee, part of what we want to do is give them the grief education when they say, I don't want you to tell anyone. To be able to come in and say that makes perfect sense. In our experience, that doesn't usually work for people, including you as the griever, because again, we have a lot of internal and instinctive wisdom on how to grieve. But because we have not had any grief education, sometimes the decisions that we try and make for ourselves are not very well informed. And that one, we're not going to say anything about this at work. We're not going to do it. We're not going to make any announcement. We actually have tons of data that not only doesn't work for the griever, it doesn't work for the people around. It feels unsafe because what it's when someone says, I'm not in a bad mood, and they are, you can feel that coming off their body.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very good point. Margot, so just to say, somebody has said, can't agree more, Tim. It's been 7 years for me, and compartmentalizing is good. However, it's not always possible. We are real people and need space to vent and grieve. Thank you for sharing. Margot, just coming back to you a second, somebody wrote something really interesting. So they've said, from an HR background, I've worked with a colleague recently to find them an alternative role. We have a safe space identified to allow for retreat if they feel overloaded. So that's a really practical, good takeaway. And Margot, they've said, what else can I do better to support her?
So I love the safe space. That's something really important that I recommend that people do before someone comes back, whether that's an office, a conference room, a friend's, work friend's office, whatever that is, where someone can go, because as all of us know, that grief will overwhelm you at different points during the day, and you need somewhere to go to be together. I think that, we've touched on a number of things that someone can do. I think it's wonderful to have that person check in addition to the manager. Because for all the best intention of the manager, if that person hasn't had experience with devastating loss, it's good to have a second point of contact within HR. I think encouraging that person, for example, to perhaps consider some therapy or a support group. And running point on that. For example, one of the people I interviewed for my book was able to go and attend an 8-week session after she lost her husband, and her boss allowed her to go and then encouraged her not to come back to work afterwards. And if that's something where the boss might not be familiar with how important that is, that's another thing where HR can come forward and say, we found this grief support group, your employee would like to go. And we think it would be really helpful if you didn't make them come back into work, so that they could just go home and process what they've just been through. So I think there's all sorts of points where the person from HR can either be working directly with the person who's grieving, or, to Megan's point that she's made, helping to gently educate the boss about why certain things might be happening, why this person might be feeling a certain way or behaving a certain way, and just making up a really important piece of that person's support at work.
Thank you, Margot. I can't actually believe how quickly the time has gone. And we seem to have 5 minutes left, and I feel as though we started 5 minutes ago. So I'm not sure how that has happened. But one very quick thing that I want to just finish on is that I just want to focus from each one of you about what happens. The world of loss. We've all talked in this session today about quite severe loss and very close loss. But what about the world doesn't always acknowledge one loss being as valid as another? So not a close family member or somebody very close to you, a pet or something or other, and how the workplace can take that on board too, that they're not sort of saying, oh, well, that wasn't a close family member, we can't give them as much time, or whatever it might be. The stigma of different grieving, if you like. And I just wonder whether we can just comment on that. Obviously, they have different impacts perhaps, but I think the workplace needs to understand that as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Margot, what do you think about that?
Absolutely. And, we rank grief. right? And so child loss is worse than grandparent loss, is worse than pet loss. And instead, we need to honor losses, that loss is loss, and that the person who has suffered the loss is the one who gets to say how important it is. I think one of the biggest problems with the bereavement policies that companies do have is that they are so specific about where that person fits on the family tree. So you don't get much time, but you get more time. It's, for example, if it's a child or a parent or a spouse. But if it's an aunt or uncle or a cousin who's like a sibling to you, or a grandparent who raised you, for example, you get less time off. And if it's a best friend or an ex-partner, or a pet, you may get no time off at all. And so I think it's critically important that we look to the person who's grieving and ask them to tell us how significant the loss is, and then behave accordingly, as opposed to trying to look at it where they fit on the family tree or where we think the loss ought to rank.
I think that is so important. And do you know something? Instead of asking all three of you, I might go over by 5 minutes, and I'm really sorry, but this last question that's come through, I do not want to ignore. So Megan, I'm going to come to you on this to say, can you talk a little bit about dealing with the grief of a loss of a colleague? It's one of those instances where some people at work understand what you're going through, while others who didn't work with the person do not know. And it's challenging because people don't see it as the same as the loss of a family member, but it affects you every day. I didn't want to finish this session without looking at the loss of a colleague.
Yeah, so I'll say a couple of things. One is, I'm assuming that person means the death of a colleague. But
Yes.
What I've seen during COVID is all these ways in which people's work lives have been profoundly 1,500 people are being laid off. Their colleague moved to Austin, their mentor moved to Austin. So when we're looking at loss, Margot is exactly right. You can put whatever you want in your policy about what the company thinks you should feel, but it is only the person who is doing the feeling. They are the expert and the instructor. So if you have had a loss at work, if a colleague has died, that's like a workplace injury, right? So we can look to some of the policies that exist. I'm thinking about, FMLA in this country is you can take time off to take care of a family member who is ill. You can use that for maternity leave. And a doctor can write you a note to say that you are having your own symptoms. Someone says, we believe and trust that you are suffering inside this system. At work, I would assume that you have employees that are suffering from the loss of a colleague. And I would do what Tim has described, which is, even if no one comes, get a counselor to come and sit in the conference room and run a group for anyone who was impacted. And then when you're walking around in the halls, you don't feel that thing that grievers talk about, which is alone and isolated. Because you didn't realize that Sally from accounting was also really close to Steve, but now you sat in that meeting and you guys have that bond and that connection between you. So it is actually, I think, when there is a death in the workplace, it is incumbent on your environment there to say, we are going to give you supports, including therapy during the day, and not just for 3 weeks, for as long as you say that you need it, because people can have feelings and opinions about your emotional experience, but they literally have no impact on your emotional experience, except maybe stress you out more. It's not going to make me get better faster or be able to work better sooner because you don't like that I was so devastated when my boss died suddenly.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I can't thank all of you on the panel enough for having such an engaging conversation. And I think helping from the feedback that I'm getting coming into the box here, that I think it's given a lot of people a lot to think about. And I hope in some way that if your organization isn't doing anything, whether you have suffered any kind of grief at all or not, that maybe it empowers you to do something like Tim has done and to see the ripple effect of everything that he has created, because I definitely think that Delta is a shining light, but they really shouldn't be the only light. We should have all of these lights in so many different organizations, and that's what we really, really want to try and achieve. So to Tim, to Megan, to Margot, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to the audience as well for being with us today. Very, very much appreciate you joining us. Have a good rest of your day, everybody, wherever you are in the world, and maybe we'll be back again soon to continue the conversation. Thank you, everyone.